10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 65. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. My name is Nick Manella, and I am the creator and host of this show. If you're brand new to the podcast, then welcome. And what we try to do is we give you a short and concise 10-minute jazz lesson every single week, complete with downloadable PDF, which you can find at our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com. That's the number 10, minutejazzlesson.com. So today we're going to talk about a couple of pieces of vocabulary from, I think, one of the greatest alto players in the history of jazz, Phil Woods. He's such an important voice after Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker looms so large on the alto saxophone and saxophone in general that I find it truly amazing when somebody from the kind of the same era, a little bit after Charlie Parker, comes along and really revolutionizes the voice of a particular instrument, and Phil Woods was that musician. He kind of came onto the scene and really developed his own style on the alto while still nodding to the tradition. He really did his own thing, and I think we can all sort of look up to that on whatever instrument we play, becoming our own voice, even though we still have to nod to that tradition that came before us. So we're going to take a look at two different lines today. The first one is a nice 2-5-1 in the key of B flat major. And then we're going to look at a half diminished 2-5-1 or a minor 2-5-1, whatever you want to call it, where he does some incredible harmonic stuff. So let's jump into the first line. This line is, like I said, a major 2-5-1 in Phil Woods' key of B flat major. And this line is great because Phil really teaches us that I think sometimes when we are playing over a 2-5-1, we by default kind of go into eighth note mode, right? Where we just play continuous running eighth notes and we're playing stuff verbatim from vocabulary that we've learned or whatever. And this line is really important because Phil Woods really shows us how to utilize space, and how a well-placed rest can really, transform our lines into something predictable into something that's going to sort of surprise and delight the people that are listening to us play. So if you check out this line, he starts up on the 13 of the minor chord, and he plays down, he does a very typical sort of bebop thing, where he does an eighth note followed by 2 16th notes, and then he comes down the chord and plays a lot of these chord tones, coming down to the fifth and then the third. Then he jumps down to the root all the way down to the fifth, coming back to the seventh and then back to the fifth. And then we find ourselves in the 5 chord, where he basically just goes right up the arpeggio. He goes 3 to 5 to 7, back to 3. So he goes right up the arpeggio there, 3, 5, 7, 3. Then comes the part that I really enjoy, where he leaves actually 2 entire beats of space, which we don't necessarily hear a lot. Sometimes it's hard to restrain ourselves and actually use a little bit of space, but Phil Woods does it right in the middle of the line, which is kind of the toughest part. And also the coolest thing about this line is that he actually avoids the resolution point, which I think a lot of us are under the impression that this is kind of a big no-no when we're playing over a 2-5, is to not actually play across the bar line into the resolution to the 1 chord. But Phil Woods shows us that it is entirely possible to do this and make it sound great. So he leaves the beat 3 and beat 4 over the 5 chord totally empty, just space, right? And then he rests all the way until the end of 1 on the 1 chord, where he proceeds to play a little scale thing combined with a arpeggio, and he comes back in on the end of 1 with the major 7 down to the 13 to the 5, and then he goes down the arpeggio to the 3 to the major 7 again. Then he plays a nice little scale thing to round out the line. So he goes back to the 9, back to the major 7, and then he plays 1, 2, 3, 5, which is also an important piece of vocabulary that we may cover on further episodes of the podcast. That 1, 2, 3, 5 is very important because it outlines the chord and the scale both at the same time. So let's check out what this line sounds like. Notice the space and notice his restraint over the resolution point. Here's what the line sounds like. So what a great line, and you can really hear that how much that space really strikes you because you don't hear it all that much when it comes to playing over a 2-5. So let's go into the second line now. So this is a minor 2-5-1, which basically means that we're going to have a half diminished 2 chord, and then we're going to have a 5 chord that includes a flat 9, that diminished dominant sound that we've talked about so much on this podcast. And then we're going to resolve to a minor chord, right? And we're doing this all in the key of A minor. This particular line goes back to our eighth note styling where it's just running eighth notes, right? So it's kind of the polar opposite of the one that we just came from. But I think that this line demonstrates a lot of really nice stuff as well, particularly a lot of chromatic material that sounds really, really great over these chords. So we see him start on the 3rd of the 2 chord, and he comes right down the scale. So 2 flat 9, or I'm sorry, 3 flat 9, and then he has 1 goes to the dominant 7. Then he actually goes to the regular 13, which is usually a no-no over the minor 7 flat 5 chord, but what he's really doing is he's sort of already starting to play the 5 chord in the second half of the first measure. So he comes down to that 13, goes back up to the root, comes down to the flatted 5th, and then actually goes to the major 3rd. But let's think about this for a second, because what he's really doing is, I always say this in jazz, it's usually about where you're going, not about where you're coming from or where you currently are. A lot of the time it's about where you're going. So what he's doing on beat 4 of the 2 chord is he's surrounding the root of the 5 chord by playing an F and a D sharp and then resolving it to E over the 5 chord. So then he starts playing over the 5 chord on the root, comes up to the flat 9, goes to the 3, jumps up to the 5, goes all the way back up to the root, and starts coming back down again by going root 7, flat 13, sharp 11, and then we are getting to the 1 chord here, the minor 1 chord, right? Where he plays 9, major 7, and then goes right up the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then skips and jumps up to the 7, and then we hear the 13 over the minor chord, or the 6, which is a really, really nice tension to play over that. We see that 13 up to the root again, down to the 5, down to the 3, and then 4 or 11, down to 1. I know that's a mouthful, but make sure that you have the PDF in front of you when I'm explaining it, and it'll make a heck of a lot more sense. So let's check out what this one sounds like. Really notice the chromaticism and some of the stuff he does when he kind of steps out of bounds and plays notes that aren't technically supposed to be there, but it actually sounds really good. That's a really great lesson to learn from him. Here's what this line sounds like. Sorry about my horrible piano playing, guys. My saxophone is a little bit under the weather, and I'm getting it repaired today. So I had to play piano for you. But I think I'm playing it so slow that maybe you can actually hear the harmony a little bit better than if I were playing it on saxophone. But as you can hear, I'm not the best piano player on earth. All right, so I hope that helps you guys. Take that line, work it into your playing, switch it around, do something different with it, take the concepts out of it. And most importantly, if you have any questions, make sure you get in touch with me. 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. All right, everybody, we'll talk to you next week. Have a great one.